Greetings and welcome to another video by Crosswalk Test Prep and Tutoring. In today's video, I want to talk to you about how I use a test prep dashboard to track and monitor student performance on the SAT and ACT over time. The test prep dashboard is a pretty simple spreadsheet that I developed years ago, and at the first step, it looks like a way to just log in test performance over time. But really the deeper dive is what we'll get into today, is actually identifying categories of questions that students consistently get wrong in order to be able to work on those questions to get better at them. So let me start by showing you how I work with students either in a group class or in an individual. And we usually work out of a shared drive in which there are resources and handouts and practice tests. This drive here is accessible to any students who sign up for a program at Crosswalk, including those who do the self-paced program, because a lot of these things you can do on your own without the guidance of a tutor. If you need it, we're here for you. But what I want to highlight here is this document here, which is the sample test prep dashboard, and I'll show you what it looks like. The first tab of the test prep dashboard is pretty general information. And for the purposes of this activity, I created a student that we're going to talk about, Fernando. Let's say Fernando wants to use this dashboard. Well, we'd create his own copy of this, and I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. But in general, we would start with something like this. These two boxes here give Fernando a sense of how many correct questions that he needs to answer on each section of the test to get to a goal score. That's this yellow number here. I really spent a lot of time with students focusing on what their goal score is. And a goal score is essentially defined as the score they need to be admitted into the schools of their choice. And notice I say schools. When working with students, we should always think about multiple schools. Any student that's really only focused on one school is limiting their options. So once we figure out what that goal score is, we can put that number into there. These yellow boxes mean you can kind of change the numbers. And let's say in our research, Fernando wants to get a 1400. Well, what that means is on the SAT, he's going to roughly need 58 correct answers out of 66 in the reading and writing, or 48 correct answers in 54 questions on the math. Now, if we change that, say, hey, we don't necessarily need that competitive of a score. Fernando's going to be good with a 1200. I change that number in the yellow, and that changes my formula here. And again, this is a place to start with students to be able to say, hey, this is actually a manageable process. Don't think that you need a 1600 on this test. You don't need a perfect score. You don't need 100%. You just need to get to that place where you're going to be considered for admission in the schools of your choice. Same goes for ACT. Let's say 32 is a little too aggressive and Fernando can do a 30. That changes the numbers on those sections here. So that's where I usually start. As I scroll down the next section, which is blank, and I'll show you what a more completed version looks like for Fernando in a moment, but this becomes the place to input test scores over time, whether the date, the version, did you take it at school or maybe at home as a practice test. We input the scores and then make some notes about it. Let's say a student, over time actually sees maybe they're getting better, but boop, the third time they took the test, it went down. Well, why was that? We kind of lean into that and say, well, was it because you were distracted or was there something else going on? And then we try and identify those things so we can prevent that moving forward. So this is the first tab. The second tab, if I jump over here, is the individual SAT score. So one of the tests that we pull from the overall dashboard, we'll dive into here. And what I really want to do with students here is parse out why they missed a particular question. So in our example here, let's say it was SAT number 1. It was the digital practice test that you downloaded from the College Board or use the Blue Book, whatever. What we want to get into is why a student missed particular questions, and then we list them out. And it's not just the question number. We also really want to understand why the student missed that particular question, because then we can start to see some themes and we can categorize groups. If we all of a sudden see that every time that student is missing a vocabulary and context question, well, that's great information for us. We've identified a weakness for that student. And here at Crosswalk, we love weaknesses. Weaknesses, if you watch any other videos, are an opportunity to get better. And weaknesses are a space in case the test is tomorrow, you can guess on those and not have to spend time on them to then score points in areas of your strength. But in identifying these weaknesses, we can then say, all right, we need to work on vocabulary, or maybe it's punctuation, or maybe it's reading comprehension, whatever that is. Same goes for math. Math would be on this side, and we would do that same process. The one wrinkle for math, and if I circle it here, is whether or not that question, in terms of why it was wrong, was a content thing or a careless thing. In other words, did a student not get the question correct because they don't know the content? Or did a student not get a question correct because they made a careless mistake, like a miscalculation, or they misread the question? Now, when we put all this together, again, we start to parse out some themes to say, all right, maybe we need to work on this particular area or that particular area. So again, this is the general process here. Let me show you what it would look like if we actually pull in Fernando's version. Here's a little bit more detailed approach from Fernando. We say Fernando is looking for a 1450 on this score. It's a pretty aggressive score, roughly a 90%. He needs to get on that, not counting for scale. I'm not even getting into scale here in this process, and we can, talk about that later or work with students on that later. But in general, just a ballpark number, a rough estimate, hence the double asterisks. And I'll focus on SAT for Fernando right now. We could do the same thing for ACT, but in Fernando's performance, we note that, okay, Fernando took a PSAT last year. This was done at school, and this was the score. Now he's starting to ramp up this year and taking the test in August. He did it at home. This was just a practice test. So we note these, and the score is going up. All right. Now, one thing we can look at Fernando, he's still a long way away. 1170 is a long way away from the 1450, but we could start to look at, okay, how does he go and get those questions back? So we go to the second tab, the individual SAT analysis, and this is what it looks like if it were completed. This was the SAT test version, a practice one. And what we did is we went through every single question to see why did he get it wrong and what happened. And this is the example of how to use it, which is also available on that sample test prep dashboard. But what we started to do is to chart out what kind of questions he got wrong. And you notice we then actually color coded it. And we realized that, okay, the blue ones are the reading comprehension ones, whereas the green ones have to do with either grammar or structure. And we can start to see some themes. Notice that 1, 2, 3, 4 out of his overall incorrect answers were vocabulary. Well, great. That's an opportunity to be like, okay, Fernando, you need to work on your vocabulary and context. We're going to pull out some resources to help you learn some SAT vocabulary. If we look at the grammar ones, we start to see, well, there's not exactly a whole lot of themes here, but maybe there's an opportunity to work on some pronouns and some signposts. Maybe that's kind of what we work on there. Whereas on the math side, notice what we're doing. We're also charting out whether they are content or careless. That's the key thing here with math. And if it is content, what is the content? And so in module 1, Fernando in this case missed 4, and we're looking at, okay, maybe he misread that question. That was a careless error. Those are in blue, versus the green are the content errors. And if we look at this, we have to say, okay, graphing a function and function, that becomes a space where we might want to say, hey, we're going to dive into this a little bit further. This is a weakness for us. But really, the whole goal in this whole thing is to have a dashboard, have a general approach here about where the score has gone over time, and then having the detailed report here of what to work on. And that's it. That's the sample test dashboard available in the shared drive that we use with our students at Crosswalk. If you have any questions or want to learn more, feel free to reach out to Crosswalk. Thanks so much.